The morning Elvira Reed walked into the Haskell County courthouse with a complaint folded neatly in her calloused hands. Every man in the building turned to stare, because nobody in the whole of southwest Kansas had ever dared put their grievances against Clarence Morrow down on paper and hand them to a judge. The year was 1883, and Haskell County was the kind of place where the wind came in from the south and the dust never truly settled, where cattle drives still cut through the tall grass, and the law had a way of bending toward whoever held the most land. Clarence Morrow held most of it. He owned the grain mill, the only functioning livery stable in the town of Sagebrush Flats, 240 acres of prime grazing land along the Cimarron River, and the ear of Judge Hollis Fenton, who had been appointed to the bench 3 years prior through means that most decent people preferred not to discuss at supper. Elvira had not always been brave. She would have been the first to admit that. She had been the wife of Samuel Reed, a quiet and good man who had come west from Missouri with a dream of homesteading a parcel of land and raising cattle. Samuel had built their house board by board with his own hands, dug the well himself, coaxed crops from ground that had no particular interest in cooperating. They had been married 7 years before the fever took him in the autumn of 1882, and she had buried him beneath the old cottonwood at the edge of their property on a gray October morning with their daughter Lily, who was 9 years old, standing beside her in a dress that was already too short. Elvira was 31 years old when Samuel died, and the grief had been a weight that pressed down on everything, on the mornings when she had to light the stove alone, on the evenings when the house went quiet in a way that had no comfort in it. But she had kept going, because Lily needed feeding, because the cattle needed tending, and because she was made of something stubborn that she had inherited from her mother and had no intention of letting go of. The trouble with Clarence Morrow had begun 4 months after Samuel's death. Morrow had sent a man named Grady Fitch to her door with a document that he wanted her to sign, something to do with the boundary survey of her 40 acres and a supposed error in the original land claim that, according to Fitch, meant that 8 of her best grazing acres technically belonged to Morrow's adjacent parcel. She had not signed. Fitch had come back twice more. She had not signed either of those times. Then the fence appeared. One morning, in February of 1883, she had walked out to check on her cattle and found a new line of barbed wire cutting straight through the middle of what had always been her pasture, angled in a way that pushed her cattle back and cut off their access to the small creek tributary that ran through the lower portion of the land. She had pulled the wire down with her bare hands, earning herself a line of thin cuts across her palms that she wrapped in strips of flour sack cloth. The fence went back up 2 days later. She pulled it down again. That was when Grady Fitch came back, and this time he did not bring a document. He stood at her door in the early evening with the sun making long orange shadows behind him, and told her, in a tone that was almost polite but not quite, that Mr. Morrow was a patient man, but that patience had natural limits, and that a woman alone with a child and no particular standing in the county might want to consider the wisdom of settling things quietly. Elvira had looked at Fitch for a long moment, long enough that he had shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and then she had told him to get off her property and not come back. She had ridden into Sagebrush Flats the very next morning to speak with the county clerk about filing a formal complaint with the circuit court regarding unlawful encroachment on deeded property. The clerk, a nervous young man named Beaufort Sims, had looked at her as though she had asked him to help her wrestle a mountain lion, but she had placed Samuel's original land deed and her own documentation of the fence's placement on his counter, and told him to show her the proper forms, and eventually he had. That was how she ended up in the courthouse on that particular Tuesday morning in March of 1883, with the cold still biting at the backs of people's necks and the mud on Main Street thick enough to swallow a boot-heel hole. She did not know, when she walked through that door, that a man she had never laid eyes on was about to change the course of everything. Theodore Hartwell had come into Sagebrush Flats 2 days before Elvira filed her complaint, though he had not particularly meant to stay. He was 34 years old, a cattle drover by trade who had been working the drives between Texas and Kansas for the better part of a decade. He was tall and lean in the way that men who spend years in the saddle tend to become, with dark hair that had started to acquire a thread or two of silver at the temples and eyes that were a peculiar shade of brown that shifted toward amber in certain lights. He had a scar along the left side of his jaw from a disagreement with a branding iron when he was 19, and his hands were large and brown, and capable of the particular kind of patience that horses and cattle respond to. He had ridden into town with a companion, a fellow drover named Pete Alvarez, and their intention had been to resupply, rest for a night or two, and then continue northeast to meet up with another outfit that was hiring for the spring drive. Theirs was not a complicated plan, and Theodore had always liked uncomplicated plans. He was in the general store selecting a sack of coffee when he heard two men talking near the back of the place where the dry goods were stacked. He was not attempting to eavesdrop, but the store was not large and the men were not quiet. "You hear about the Reed woman," one of them said. "The widow, what about her? She's gone and filed papers against Morrow." With the court, actual legal papers. There was a silence that was heavy with the kind of disbelief that sits in a person's chest before it becomes something else. "Lord Almighty," the second man said, "she must not understand what she's doing. Or she understands perfectly fine and just doesn't have the sense to be scared. Either way, Fenton's not going to do a thing with those papers. Morrow plays cards with the man every Friday. She's going to find herself in a worse position than before. Somebody ought to tell her. Somebody ought to do a lot of things," the first man said, and his voice had that particular quality of a man who has no intention of doing any of them himself. Theodore set the coffee sack on the counter and paid for it without saying a word to the two men, but the conversation stayed with him in the way that certain things do when they catch somewhere beneath the ribs. He asked the store clerk about it as casually as he could manage. The clerk, who turned out to be considerably more talkative than the situation probably required, told him the whole of it, including the specifics of the fence and the land dispute, and who Clarence Morrow was, and what Judge Fenton's particular brand of justice tended to look like. By the end of the account, Theodore had a clear enough picture to know that what was happening to Elvira Reed was wrong in a way that was clean and uncomplicated, the kind of wrong that did not require a great deal of analysis. He found Pete Alvarez outside the livery stable and told him he might be staying in Sagebrush Flats a little longer than originally planned. Pete, who had known Theodore for 6 years and understood certain things about him without needing them explained in full, looked at him with a measured expression. "Is this the kind of staying that has something to do with that widow who filed against Morrow?" he asked. "You heard about that already. This is a small town, Theo. You hear about everything in the first 10 minutes. I might go speak with her," Theodore said, "just to let her know what she's dealing with." Pete looked at him for another moment. "The drive starts in 4 weeks, he said. "I know," Theodore said. "All right," Pete said, which was the kind of answer that meant a great deal more than the 2 words themselves. Theodore did not charge into anything, which was one of the things that distinguished him from younger men who had not yet learned that haste tends to compound problems rather than solve them. He asked around town carefully, speaking to the blacksmith and to the woman who ran the boarding house, and to an old rancher named Curtis Webb who had been in the area since before the county was properly organized, and what he gathered was consistent. Elvira Reed was regarded as a capable and honest woman who had kept her homestead running after her husband's death by sheer force of will. Clarence Morrow was regarded as a man who had built his empire through a combination of legitimate hard work and a flexible interpretation of what belonged to him. And Judge Fenton was regarded as a man who had very comfortable evenings on Friday nights. On the morning Elvira filed her complaint, Theodore was sitting on the bench outside the general store with a cup of coffee, watching the courthouse across the street. He had not planned to be there exactly, but he had found himself there anyway, the way a person sometimes finds themselves exactly where something important is about to happen. He saw her walk up the courthouse steps. She was not what he had particularly been picturing, though he realized after the fact that he had not been picturing anything specific. She was a woman of medium height with dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a practical bonnet, wearing a dress of deep blue wool that had seen considerable use but was clean and neat about it. She carried herself with a straightness of spine that was not arrogance but something quieter and more durable, the posture of a person who has decided that whatever is coming, they are going to face it standing upright. She came back out of the courthouse 20 minutes later, and something in her expression had shifted. Not broken, but changed. The way a person looks when they have done something difficult and discovered that the difficulty was only the beginning. Theodore stood up without quite deciding to and crossed the street. He did not have a rehearsed speech. He had simply the truth of the situation and a direct manner that had always served him better than elaborate preparation. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, catching her at the bottom of the courthouse steps. "Are you Mrs. Reed?" She stopped and looked at him with the particular alertness of a woman who has learned to assess strangers quickly. Her eyes were green, a genuine deep green with flecks of something lighter in them, and they were currently engaged in figuring out exactly who he was and whether he represented a new problem. "I am," she said. "Who are you?" "Theodore Hartwell, ma'am." "I'm a drover just passing through. I heard about your situation and I wanted you to know that I think what you're doing is right and I'd like to help if you'll have it." The look she gave him was not unkind, but it was entirely serious. "Mr. Hartwell, I don't know you from Adam. Why in the world would a drover just passing through concern himself with my business?" It was a fair question, and he gave it the honest answer it deserved. "Because what's being done to you is wrong, and I have a particular dislike for powerful men who use their position to take from people who can't easily defend themselves. And I have some time before my next obligation, and I have some experience with legal matters that might be useful to you." She studied him. He had the sense that she was accustomed to making accurate judgments about people, the way someone is when they have had to learn it by necessity. "You said you have experience with legal matters," she said. "What kind of experience?" "My father was an attorney in Cincinnati before he moved west," Theodore said. "He kept good books. I spent a good many evenings reading them as a young man. I'm not a lawyer myself, but I understand enough about property law to know that what Morrow is claiming about your land survey is likely based on a fraudulent interpretation of the original plat records, and that there may be a way to challenge it that doesn't rely entirely on Judge Fenton being a fair man." There was a pause that might have been 5 seconds or 10. The wind came down Main Street and lifted the edge of her bonnet ribbon. "All right, Mr. Hartwell," Elvira said at last. "I am having supper at the Weston boarding house this evening, and there is a parlor there where we can talk. 6 o'clock. "I'll be there," he said. She nodded once, as though this had been a business transaction, which perhaps it had, and walked away down the street. He watched her go and had the distinct and unusual experience of feeling as though something that had been idle in him for a long time had just woken up and was paying close attention. He was at the boarding house at 5 minutes before 6, which was not accidental. The parlor of the Weston boarding house was a small and somewhat crowded room, furnished with the determined respectability of a woman who believed that doilies and good upholstery could impose civilization on even the most remote corners of the frontier. Mrs. Weston herself, a formidable woman of 60 with silver hair and opinions, brought them tea they had not asked for, and then positioned herself in the adjoining room with the door not entirely shut, which Theodore understood was the arrangement being offered in the interest of propriety. Elvira arrived with her daughter Lily, who was 9 years old and possessed of a direct and curious gaze that she had evidently inherited from her mother. Lily looked at Theodore with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise her evaluations, decided something about him, and then occupied herself with a book in the corner in a way that suggested she was listening to every word. Elvira sat across from Theodore at the small table and spread out the papers she had brought with her. There was the original land deed in Samuel Reed's name, a copy of the complaint she had filed that morning, a hand-drawn map of the property boundaries that Samuel had made years ago, and a letter from a surveyor named Harrison Mills who had done work in the county 3 years prior, and whose notes, Elvira explained, had been what Morrow's people had used to claim the boundary error. Theodore looked at everything carefully. He took his time, which Elvira seemed to respect rather than resent. She poured tea for both of them without asking and sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching him with those green eyes. "The problem," Theodore said after a long while, "is that Morrow's claim is based on Mills's survey, which I suspect was either commissioned by Morrow or adjusted after the fact to suit him. The original land grant registered with the Territorial Land Office would take precedence over a private survey if there's a discrepancy. Do you know where the original plat records are filed?" "The county recorder's office," Elvira said, "or they should be. The difficulty is that Beaufort Sims, the county clerk, is about as likely to hand me access to those records as he is to sprout wings." "Sims answers to the county recorder," Theodore said. "Who is that?" "A man named Orland Price. He's not a Morrow man, at least not to my knowledge. He's been recorder for 15 years and has a reputation for keeping careful books." Theodore tapped the table thoughtfully. "Then Price is worth visiting. If the original plat records show your boundary as you claim it, and there is a discrepancy between those records and Mills's survey, then you have grounds for a legal challenge that is about the integrity of the public record, not just a dispute between you and Morrow. That's harder to bury." Elvira was quiet for a moment. "You really have read your father's books," she said. "I had a lot of evenings," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Why are you really doing this, Mr. Hartwell? You don't know me." "You owe me nothing." He considered the question with the seriousness it asked for. "I've spent 10 years on cattle drives," he said. "I've been through a great many towns and I've seen a great many situations like yours, and I've ridden past most of them because they weren't my affair and I had somewhere to be. I'm tired of riding past things." He paused. "And because it's the right thing to do, and because whoever your husband was, he built something with his own hands and it ought to stand." Something moved across her face. Not softness exactly, but something that was no longer entirely guarded. "Samuel did build it," she said quietly. "He was very proud of it." "Then let's see if we can keep it," Theodore said. They talked for another hour, mapping out what needed to be done. Theodore would accompany Elvira to see Orland Price the following morning, both because he knew what questions to ask about the plat records, and because a woman presenting a legal challenge on her own in a town like Sagebrush Flats was considerably easier to dismiss than a woman accompanied by a sizable and plainly direct man who was not visibly frightened of anything. It was not fair that this was true, but it was true, and they were dealing with the world as it was. When they stood to leave, Lily closed her book and tucked it under her arm and looked at Theodore again with that direct gaze. "Are you a good man?" she asked him. "Lily," Elvira said. "It's all right," Theodore said. He crouched down to the child's level, which was something that came naturally to him, and met her eyes. "I try to be," he told her. "I don't always manage it, but I try. That's the honest answer." Lily considered this for a moment. "That's a better answer than if you just said yes," she said, and went to stand beside her mother. Theodore walked home through the cold evening with the strange and particular feeling that Sagebrush Flats had become somewhat more interesting than he had anticipated. Orland Price was a small, meticulous man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, who had the air of someone who genuinely loved the ordering of information, and felt vaguely irritated by the rest of the world's inability to maintain proper filing systems. His office in the courthouse annex was extraordinarily well organized, with shelves of bound ledgers labeled with a precision that bordered on devotion. When Elvira and Theodore arrived and explained what they were looking for, Price looked at Elvira over his spectacles with an expression that Theodore read as a complicated mixture of sympathy and reluctance. "The original plat records for the Cimarron Creek sections are all here," Price said. "They've always been here. The question is whether Mr. Morrow's surveyor consulted them before drawing up his own document." "May we see them?" Theodore asked. Price hesitated. Then he said, "Mr. Morrow is a man who has a great deal of influence in this county, Mr. Hartwell." "I'm aware of that," Theodore said. "And the public record belongs to the public, Mr. Price, including Mrs. Reed." Another hesitation. Then Price pulled a large bound volume from the shelf, opened it on his table, and said, "I'll leave you to it for 20 minutes. I need to attend to something down the hall." He walked out, and both Theodore and Elvira understood that this was Price's way of helping without appearing to help, which was cowardly in one respect and courageous in another. Theodore found what he was looking for in 11 minutes. The original land grant for Samuel Reed's parcel, recorded in 1876, showed the eastern boundary of the property running along a specific line that was clearly and unambiguously different from the line that Harrison Mills's survey had established. The difference was 8 acres of land that sat along a creek tributary and represented, in practical terms, the difference between a viable cattle operation and one that was slowly choked of water access. Theodore copied the relevant entries down carefully in his notebook, noting the record book number and page, the date of filing, and the precise boundary description as recorded. When Price returned to his office, Theodore shook the man's hand and thanked him, and Price said that he had not done anything in particular, which they all understood was a polite fiction serving everyone's purposes. Out on the street, Elvira gripped the notebook Theodore had handed her and looked at the figures inside it with an expression that was fierce and not entirely dry. "This is exactly what I knew was there," she said. "I knew the original deed was right." "The deed is right," Theodore confirmed. "The question now is what we do with this." "We take it back to the circuit court," Elvira said immediately. "We do," Theodore said, "but I want to do it in a way that makes it difficult for Fenton to dismiss, which means we need a third party to verify these records, someone credible who isn't connected to Morrow and isn't under Fenton's jurisdiction." Elvira thought about this. "There's a land attorney in Dodge City," she said. "A man named Charles Beaumont. He has a good reputation. He handled the Whitfield cattle dispute last spring and came away clean. Can you afford to hire him?" She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment he understood something about the quiet courage it took to admit financial difficulty to a stranger. "I have some money put by," she said. "It was meant for the well casing that needs replacing, but this is more urgent." "I'll ride to Dodge City," Theodore said. "You shouldn't make the trip alone, and you shouldn't leave Lily." She looked at him sharply. "Mr. Hartwell, you are not my—" "I know I'm not," he said, and his voice was measured and calm and not at all backing away from what he meant. "I'm offering to be useful, nothing more complicated than that." She held his gaze for a long moment. The wind moved between them. "All right," she said. "I'll write you a letter for Beaumont explaining the situation and authorizing you to act on my behalf. When can you leave?" "Tomorrow morning," he said. The ride to Dodge City took most of a full day on a good horse, and Theodore had a good horse, a dun gelding named Sullivan who had covered considerable ground over the years without complaint. The spring prairie was in the strange transition between winter's gray and the green that was coming, tufts of new grass showing between the old dead stalks, the sky enormous and pale blue overhead, the kind of sky that makes a person feel simultaneously small and free. Theodore thought about Elvira Reed as he rode. He thought about the straightness of her spine and the green of her eyes, and the way she had looked at the plat records with a fierceness that was entirely personal, the look of a person defending something they had built with their own life. He thought about what she had said about Samuel building the house board by board, and about the particular quality of grief in her voice when she said it. Not raw grief, but settled grief. the kind that has found its permanent place inside a person. He was not a man who had spent a great deal of time thinking about settling down, not because he was opposed to the idea in any theoretical sense, but because the life he had been living had not presented him with much occasion to consider it. He had been moving for 10 years, following the drives, sleeping under more stars than he could count, and there had been something good in that freedom and something that had gradually come to feel like a kind of evasion. He could not have said exactly what he was evading, only that the movement had begun to feel less like living and more like a way of not stopping. He arrived in Dodge City in the early evening and found Charles Beaumont's office on a side street off Front Avenue. Beaumont was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a dark beard and quick, precise eyes who read Elvira's letter carefully twice before looking up at Theodore. "I know of the Morrow situation," Beaumont said. "Heard about it through the circuit. I didn't know anyone had the gumption to file against him." "She has considerable gumption," Theodore said. Beaumont looked at him with a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth. "Are you a friend of Mrs. Reed's, Mr. Hartwell?" "I am becoming one," Theodore said, with a directness that surprised him slightly. Beaumont took the case. He quoted a fee that was reasonable for the work involved, asked for the original deed and a certified copy of the plat records which Theodore could obtain from Price, and explained that he would file a motion with the circuit court that would compel Judge Fenton to hear the land dispute on its formal merits, including the plat record discrepancy, or else face a challenge to his handling of the case from the state level. It was not a certain solution, but it was a serious one, the kind that Fenton could not simply discard without drawing attention. Theodore rode back to Sagebrush Flats the following day with the wind behind him and arrived in the late afternoon. He found Elvira at her property rather than in town, because of course she was at her property. She was at the fence line where Morrow's barbed wire had gone back up yet again, standing with her hands on her hips and a look of controlled fury on her face that was, Theodore thought as he rode up, genuinely impressive. She turned when she heard Sullivan's hoofbeats and the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly. "Did you find him?" she asked. "I found him," Theodore said, dismounting. "He's taking the case. He'll file the motion within the week." She pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment, a brief and entirely human gesture that she seemed to collect herself from quickly. "Good," she said, "because they put this thing back up last night." "I can help you take it down again," Theodore said. She looked at him, and something in the look was different from the ones before, not less cautious exactly, but warmer, the way a person looks at someone who has started to become real to them. "All right, Mr. Hartwell," she said. "Let's take it down." They worked together along the fence line as the afternoon light turned gold and long, using pliers Theodore pulled from his saddlebag to work the wire staples loose from the posts. It was not the most dignified work, but it had a satisfying quality about it, the physical reclamation of something that should not have been taken. Elvira worked with efficient, practiced movements, the kind that come from years of doing whatever needed to be done, and Theodore found himself watching her hands occasionally, the sureness of them, the competence. Lily appeared at the edge of the property as the light was beginning to fail, having walked out from the house, and took up a position near Theodore's horse, watching them work with her book tucked under her arm as usual. "Did you find the lawyer?" she called to Theodore. "I did," he called back. "Is he a good one?" "He seems to be." "Mama says good lawyers are as rare as good weather in February," Lily said. Theodore looked over at Elvira, who had a slight color in her cheeks that might have been the wind or might have been something else. "She's not wrong," he said. They had finished with the fence by the time the stars were beginning to appear, and Elvira straightened up and looked at the sky for a moment, breathing. Then she looked at Theodore and said something that he had not expected. "Will you stay for supper? Lily and I are having rabbit stew, and I suspect you have not had a proper meal since you rode to Dodge City." He had not, as it happened. "I would like that very much," he said. The house was exactly what he had imagined from the story of it, board by board. a small structure that was neat and well-tended and full of the particular warmth of a place where someone has put genuine care into making it livable. There was a shelf of books along one wall, a good iron stove, curtains at the windows that had been made from flour sacking and dyed blue, the evidence everywhere of someone managing with what they had and making it beautiful anyway. He sat at the table across from Lily while Elvira served the stew, which was genuinely good, rich and dark with the rabbit and potatoes and dried herbs, and Lily asked him a series of questions about cattle driving that were more informed than he would have expected from a 9-year-old, and which he answered honestly. He learned that Lily had her father's books about natural history and was reading her way through them systematically. He learned that she had named all 3 of the family's remaining cattle, which Elvira told him with the mixture of exasperation and tenderness that parents deploy when speaking of things that are both impractical and entirely endearing. After supper, when Lily had been sent to bed and the dishes were done, Elvira and Theodore sat by the stove with the last of the coffee, and the conversation moved into quieter territory. She told him more about Samuel, about the kind of man he had been, the steadiness of him, the way he had made everything around him feel safe. She told this not with the wound of fresh grief, but with the honest love of someone who has grieved properly and found a way to carry the love forward without being destroyed by it. "You must miss him very much," Theodore said. "Every day," she said simply. "But I don't intend to spend the rest of my life being only a widow. Samuel wouldn't have wanted that. He was too generous for it." Theodore looked into his coffee cup and felt something he did not have an immediate word for. "He sounds like he was a very good man," he said. "He was," she said, "the best kind." She paused. "What about you, Mr. Hartwell? Is there anyone who misses you when you're on the road?" "Not in the way you mean," he said. "My parents are gone, no siblings. I have a few good friends from the drives." "Pete Alvarez," she said, remembering. "Pete Alvarez," he confirmed. "He is a fine man and a better card player than me, which is a serious flaw in my character that I've accepted." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was genuine and warm, and it did something to the air in the room that he noticed immediately. "You're funny," she said, as though this was a discovery that mildly surprised her. "Occasionally," he said. They talked until the fire in the stove burned low, and then he rode back to the boarding house in Sagebrush Flats in the dark, and he lay awake for a considerable time looking at the ceiling and thinking about rabbit stew and a woman's laugh, and what it might mean to stop moving. Pete Alvarez, upon hearing a summary of how the last 3 days had gone, gave Theodore a look that communicated a great deal without using many words. "The drive," Pete said. "I know," Theodore said. "It starts in 3.5 weeks. I know that too. She's a widow with a land dispute and a daughter and a cattle operation to run, Theo. I know all of that, Pete." Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She must be something." "She is," Theodore said, with a directness that was unusual for him and which Pete received without comment. The legal situation developed with more speed than Theodore had expected, which he attributed to Charles Beaumont's professional competence and what turned out to be a strategic piece of timing. The Cimarron River District was due for its biannual review by a state land commissioner named Arthur Vance, who was coming through from Topeka in 3 weeks' time. Beaumont had filed his motion in a way that called specific attention to the plat record discrepancy in advance of Vance's arrival, meaning that if Judge Fenton failed to address the matter, it would be squarely in front of the state commissioner's eyes. Theodore explained all of this to Elvira on the Saturday following his Dodge City trip, when they met in the morning at the general store to go over Beaumont's letter together. She read through it with that focused intensity she brought to everything, and when she finished she looked up and said, "He's good." "He is," Theodore said. "Morrow will know about the motion by now," Elvira said. "He has people in that courthouse." "Almost certainly," Theodore said. She looked out through the store window at the town's main street, which was going about its ordinary Saturday business. "Do you think he'll try to pressure me, beyond the fence?" "I think it's possible," Theodore said carefully. I think Morrow is a man who has gotten his way through legal pressure and implied threat for a long time, and he is not going to be comfortable with having a formal legal challenge on the record. But I also think that the more formal and public this becomes, the less room he has to operate in the ways he's used to. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Grady Fitch came to my door again yesterday." Theodore felt something tighten in his chest. What did he say? He said that Mr. Morrow was a reasonable man and that there was still time to discuss a fair settlement, which would include compensation for the land if I agreed to the boundary adjustment. She paused. He also said that it was a difficult thing for a woman alone to manage a property in uncertain times. A threat dressed up as concern, Theodore said. A very thin disguise, Elvira agreed. I told him to leave again. He went. She turned back from the window and looked at Theodore directly. I'm not afraid of Grady Fitch. I know, Theodore said. I want you to know that I'm not relying on you to protect me from him. I'm relying on the law. I know that too, he said. But the law takes time, and I'll be here while it does what it needs to do. Something shifted in her expression. Not the guarded look, and not quite the warm laugh from the other evening. Something in between, more serious and more vulnerable than either. Why? She asked, and her voice was quieter than usual. Mr. Hartwell, Theodore, truly, why are you still here? He held her gaze because she deserved the honest answer and because looking away would have been a kind of cowardice. Because I find that I very much want to be, he said. The silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that is full of things being understood without being spoken. A kind of clear and uncomplicated recognition of what was happening between two people who were both too honest to pretend otherwise. I'm a widow with a land dispute and a daughter and 40 acres of difficult ground, she said, and it was not quite a warning and it was not quite a dismissal. It was the truth, stated plainly the way she did everything. I know what you are, he said. I have been paying very close attention. Another silence, shorter this time. Then Elvira said, the church social is on Sunday evening. There will be respectable company and food that I did not have to cook myself. If you happen to be there, I would not object to your company. I will be there, he said. The church social took place in the yard of the Sagebrush Flats Methodist Church, which was a modest white building that had been put up 5 years ago by a congregation that was perpetually in the process of adding to it. The evening was cool but not cold, with a sky that was going purple and orange over the flat horizon, and the yard was lit with lanterns hung from the fence posts and a bonfire at the center that sent sparks up into the darkening air. Theodore arrived at the appointed hour and found Elvira already there with Lily, talking with a woman who turned out to be her nearest neighbor, a Mrs. Clara Hadley, whose husband ran a modest sheep operation 2 miles east. Clara was a round-faced, warm-tempered woman who looked at Theodore with unconcealed curiosity when Elvira introduced him as the man helping with the land dispute. I've heard about you, Clara said. The whole county has heard about you, Mr. Hartwell. Well, the whole county has heard about the complaint, and then separately heard that there is a tall drover helping Elvira with it. I hope the account has been reasonably accurate, Theodore said. It's been mostly speculation, Clara said pleasantly, which is how things generally go. Lily tugged Theodore's sleeve and pointed toward the food table with the directness of a person who has prioritized correctly. He found himself escorting her to the table with complete willingness, loading a plate with the church women's cornbread and beans, and something that appeared to be a very fine apple cake, and Lily provided commentary on all of it with the confidence of someone who had strong opinions about baking quality. He and Elvira walked together after supper, a circuit of the church yard that was not entirely unintentional, moving slowly enough to talk and far enough from the others to have some privacy without being in any way improper. The lantern light caught the auburn of her hair where it showed beneath the brim of her bonnet, and the firelight made her eyes darker and brighter at once. She told him about coming west originally, about being a girl in St. Louis, and the way she had imagined the prairie as a girl, and the way it had turned out to be entirely different from the imagining and entirely better in certain ways and harder in others. She told him about meeting Samuel at a church meeting in Missouri, about his particular way of listening when she spoke, as though what she said was genuinely interesting to him, and he was not merely waiting for his own turn to speak. "That's a rare quality in a person," Theodore said. "It is," she agreed. She glanced up at him. "You do it too, as it happens." He was aware of a warmth that was not entirely the bonfire. "Do I?" "You listen," she said. "Not just with your ears, with your whole attention." She said it matter-of-factly, as though noting something she had observed. "I notice things like that." "You notice everything," he said. "I've noticed that." She smiled, and it was different from the laugh, slower and more private, and it was the thing that most conclusively confirmed what he had already known for several days. "Tell me about the drives," she said. "What is it actually like? Not the romantic version, the real one." He told her the truth of it. The exhaustion and the boredom and the monotonous miles, the occasional genuine beauty of a sunrise over cattle moving through tall grass, the way a good horse could save your life, and the way a bad storm could end it, the solitude of it and the camaraderie, and the way 10 years of it had shown him a great deal of the country but left him without a particular place in any of it. "Does that bother you?" she asked. "Not having a particular place?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars that were fully out now over the flat black horizon. "It did not always," he said. "It does now somewhat." She walked beside him without saying anything to that, but he had the sense she understood it entirely. Lily appeared at Elvira's side, as children do when they have run themselves to a pleasant tired, and slipped her hand into her mother's without ceremony. The three of them stood together looking at the bonfire for a moment, and Theodore was struck by the completeness of the picture, by how right it felt to be standing there, and by how unexpected that rightness was. He rode back that night thinking that 3 weeks was not very much time, and that the world was asking him to make a decision he had not known he was close to being ready to make, until he was standing in the middle of it. The following Tuesday, Grady Fitch did not come to Elvira's door. Instead, 2 of Morrow's ranch hands rode out to the property and spent the afternoon riding the fence line along the contested boundary in a deliberate and unhurried way that was designed to be seen from the house. Theodore was at the property that day, having stopped by to discuss a letter from Beaumont, and he watched the 2 men from the yard with a steady attention that they eventually noticed. One of the men rode toward him. He was broad-shouldered and had the flat, unimpressive expression of someone whose professional role was primarily to be large. "This is Mr. Morrow's land," the man said. "Do well to remember that. The courts have not agreed with that assessment," Theodore said pleasantly, "but when they do, I'll be sure to bear it in mind." The man stared at him for a moment, the kind of stare that is meant to establish dominance through duration. Theodore waited it out without any visible urgency. Eventually, the man turned his horse and rode back to his companion, and the 2 of them departed. Elvira had come to stand beside Theodore, and she watched them go with her arms folded. "They're trying to make me feel watched," she said. "Yes," Theodore agreed. "It won't work," she said. "I know," he said. She looked up at him. He was standing close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose that the March sun was beginning to call out. "You didn't back down from him," she said. "There was nothing to back down from," Theodore said. "He had words, I had words, his were less accurate." The corner of her mouth curved upward. "Theodore Hartwell," she said, and there was something in the way she said his name, the whole of it, that was different from before, familiar and intentional. "Elvira Reed," he said back, matching her tone. They stood like that in the cold spring air, closer than they had been before, and neither of them stepped back. "I need to check the cattle," she said after a moment. "Would you like to come?" "Yes," he said. "I would." They walked the property together in the afternoon light, through the pasture where her 3 cattle moved placidly in the new grass, along the creek tributary where the water ran clear and cold, and which was worth every bit of fighting for. Elvira knew every feature of the land with the intimacy of someone who has walked it in all conditions and all seasons, who has worried over it and been grateful for it and buried a husband on its edge. "This piece here," she said, pointing to a slight rise near the eastern boundary, "is where Samuel used to sit in the evenings. He said you could see 3 miles in every direction on a clear day." Theodore looked out from the rise. She was right. The evening prairie stretched away in every direction under a sky that was going golden at the edges, enormous and still. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it not only about the view. She was standing beside him, shoulder almost touching his arm, looking out at the same sky. "Yes," she said softly, "it always is." He turned and looked at her, and she turned and looked at him, and the amber light was in her hair and her eyes were very green and very honest, and he said, "I would like very much to court you, Elvira, if you would permit it. Properly. I know the timing is complicated with everything that's happening, and I know you didn't come into this situation looking for anything other than justice for your land, but I'm asking plainly because I think you deserve plainness." She was quiet for a moment that felt like a significant length of time. "The timing is complicated," she agreed, "and I did not expect this." "Neither did I," he said. "I have Lily to think of," she said. "I like Lily," he said. "She has a strong mind and very good taste in books." The slight smile, the one that was slow and private. "She likes you too," Elvira said, "which, for the record, is not easily accomplished." "I'm honored," he said, meaning it. She looked back at the horizon for a moment and then back at him. "All right, Theodore Hartwell," she said. "Court me." The next 2 weeks were among the most fully alive Theodore had felt in longer than he cared to admit. He was at her property nearly every morning, helping with the cattle and the fencing and the 100 small practical tasks that a working homestead generates in perpetual supply. He rode Lily to the schoolhouse in town on the days when the weather made the walk difficult for a child, and Lily rewarded this with the kind of informal trust that children extend when they have decided a person is worth it, asking him questions about geography and animal behavior, and the mechanics of cattle drives with the inexhaustible curiosity of someone who regards the world as fundamentally interesting. In the evenings, after Lily was in bed, he and Elvira sat by the stove and talked in the way that people do when they are falling in love and do not want to waste any of it, covering everything, their histories and their opinions and their fears, and the small daily things that accumulate into the substance of a person. She was funny in a way that was quiet and precise, observational, the kind of humor that comes from watching the world carefully. She was also, he discovered, genuinely angry about injustice in a way that was entirely consistent and not selective, that applied as readily to the situation of the homesteaders who had been driven out of the river bottom by speculative land claims as it did to her own case, that included the difficult truth that many of the people who had lost the most to men like Morrow were people who had even less recourse than she did. There was a family, she told him one evening, the Delgado family. They had land east of here, a proper claim, everything in order. But they were Mexican and Morrow wanted the land, and the courts were not inclined to look carefully at the documentation that Morrow's people produced to contest the claim. She paused. They were gone within a year. The children had been born on that land. "I know," he said quietly. "I've seen it a great many times. It makes me more determined," she said, "not just for myself. If I can show that the law can actually work the way it's supposed to, even against Morrow, even for a widow without much standing, then that means something." He looked at her across the table in the stove light and thought that he had never known anyone who made him want to be a better person simply by existing, and that this was not a thought he had ever expected to have. "You are going to win this," he told her. She met his eyes steadily. "We are going to win this," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand beneath his and let their fingers interlock, and they sat like that for a while without needing to say anything else. The motion that Charles Beaumont had filed was scheduled for hearing before Judge Fenton on the 15th of April, which gave them 3 days. State Commissioner Arthur Vance had arrived in the county the day before, and taken up residence at the best of Sagebrush Flat's 2 hotels, and his presence was like a change in the weather, the kind that everyone noticed and nobody was entirely comfortable about. Morrow himself appeared in the courthouse on the morning of the 14th, the day before the hearing, and Theodore happened to be on the street when Morrow's carriage arrived. He had not seen Morrow in person before this, had only the assembled picture that the town's accounts had built. The man was in his early 60s, still solid, with the bearing of someone who has not experienced much opposition in recent years, and has begun to regard this as the natural order of things. He was accompanied by Grady Fitch and a lawyer named Haverstock from Dodge City, which told Theodore that Morrow was taking the hearing seriously now, which was a sign that Beaumont's approach had hit its mark. Morrow did not look at Theodore as he passed, which was not personal and was also entirely deliberate. Theodore went directly to Elvira's property and told her that Morrow had arrived and brought counsel. She received this information with a nod. "Beaumont is coming tomorrow morning," she said. "Had a telegram yesterday." "Good," Theodore said. "I'm going to be there," she said. "In that courtroom, I want to look at Fenton when he has to rule on the evidence." "Of course you are," Theodore said, "and I will be there with you." She looked at him steadily. "And if Fenton rules against us despite everything, then we go to the state commissioner with the complete record and we continue," Theodore said. "But I don't think that's what will happen." She absorbed this. "You're quite certain," she said. "I am," he said. "Because the record is clear, and Morrow's surveyor produced a document that does not align with the public record, and Fenton may be a corrupt judge, but he is not a stupid one, and having Commissioner Vance in town watching him makes a fraudulent ruling an act of professional suicide rather than merely an act of ordinary corruption." "You sound like a lawyer," she said. "My father would be pleased to hear that," he said. She reached up and touched his face then, briefly, the palm of her hand against his jaw where the scar ran, and her touch was careful and entirely certain. "I am glad you came into that general store when you did," she said softly. He covered her hand with his and held it against his face for a moment. "So am I," he said. "More than I can say." The morning of the 15th arrived gray and cold, with clouds that said it might rain by afternoon. Elvira wore her best dress, a dark green wool that made her eyes remarkable, and she had done her hair with more care than usual, which Theodore noticed and did not comment on directly, but which made him feel something warm and certain in his chest. Lily was left in the care of Clara Hadley, with strict instructions about lessons and the strict additional instruction from Lily that she would require a full report upon their return. The courthouse was more crowded than Theodore had expected. The town had turned out in the way that communities do when something important is happening, and the benches were full of people who had a stake in the question of whether the county's most powerful man could be held accountable in law. Theodore sat beside Elvira in the front section, with Beaumont on her other side, a capable and confident presence with a leather document case that he kept neatly arranged in a way that conveyed serious preparation. Morrow sat across the aisle with Haverstock, and he looked at Elvira once when he came in, a look that was assessing and not particularly worried, the look of a man who has won before and expects to win again. Elvira held his gaze without flinching, which Theodore watched and felt a fierce and private pride in. Judge Fenton entered, and the room stood and settled. Fenton was a thin man with a neat gray beard who had the air of someone managing his discomfort through performance of ceremony. He knew about Commissioner Vance's presence. He knew exactly what was at stake. Beaumont presented the case with methodical clarity, the original land deed, the plat records as certified by County Recorder Price, who was present at Theodore's suggestion, and who had brought his bound volume, and set it on the table with the quiet authority of a man who has suddenly decided that 15 years of careful record-keeping has been leading to this precise moment. The discrepancy between the public record and the private survey produced by Harrison Mills on Morrow's commission. The physical evidence of the fence placement. Haverstock argued that Mills's survey superseded the original plat, and his argument was technically sophisticated but fundamentally dependent on the court, accepting a private document over the public record, which was a position that had some precedent, but which Beaumont dismantled with precise reference to 3 Kansas Circuit Court rulings from the previous decade. The courtroom was very quiet while Beaumont spoke. Theodore watched Fenton's face and read the calculation happening there, the weighing of what he owed tomorrow against what Commissioner Vance was observing, and what his career on the bench was worth in the long run. When both counsels had finished, Fenton took a recess of 30 minutes that felt considerably longer. He returned and ruled in Elvira's favor. The language was careful, legalistic, qualified, the ruling of a man who was covering himself thoroughly, but the substance was clear. The eastern boundary of the Reed property would stand as recorded in the original plat, the private survey by Harrison Mills being found to be inconsistent with the public land record, and therefore not constituting a valid basis for boundary adjustment. All encroachments, including the fence installation, were to be removed within 10 days or subject to court order. The courtroom exhaled collectively. Elvira sat very still for a moment, and Theodore felt her hand find his under the table and grip it, hard, the grip of someone who has been holding on for a long time and has just been told they can breathe. Morrow and Haverstock left without speaking. Grady Fitch, who had sat behind them, went past the row where Elvira sat and looked at her for a moment with the flat expression of a man reconsidering his assessments. She looked back at him with a calm that was unassailable, and he walked on. Beaumont shook Elvira's hand and then Theodore's, and said the outcome was entirely merited by the evidence, which was the kind of professional understatement that carries its own satisfaction. Price, collecting his record book from the evidence table, caught Theodore's eye and nodded once, and Theodore nodded back. Outside the courthouse, the gray sky had kept its promise and a light rain had begun, the kind of spring rain that is cold but not unpleasant, that smells of new earth and possible things. Elvira stood at the top of the courthouse steps and lifted her face to it briefly, eyes closed, with an expression of such complete and uncomplicated relief that Theodore felt his throat tighten. He stood beside her and let the rain fall on both of them for a moment. "You did it," he said. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and she was not entirely composed. There was something bright and ungovernable in her expression that was too full for composure. "We did it," she said. "Theodore, we," and she stopped, and then quite suddenly her arms were around him, and she was holding on in the way that people do when the tension breaks, when the thing they have been fighting for has finally happened. He put his arms around her and held her in the rain on the courthouse steps, and thought that he had arrived in Sagebrush Flats with the intention of stopping for a night or two, and that the world had conspired to give him something considerably more significant than that. She pulled back after a moment and looked up at him, a little breathless and not self-conscious about it, and the rain was on her face and her eyes were brilliantly green, and she was, in that moment, so entirely herself that it was almost too much to look at. "Come back to the property with me," she said. "Lily needs to hear the news, and I believe there may be occasion for that rather fine apple cake that Mrs. Hadley said she was bringing." "That is an excellent plan," Theodore said, and he offered her his arm and she took it, and they walked down the courthouse steps and into the rain together. The apple cake was, as advertised, extremely fine. Lily received the news of the court ruling with a gravity, and then a celebration that were each perfectly calibrated, asking 3 precise questions about the legal basis of the decision, and then running around the yard in the rain until she was thoroughly wet, which Clara Hadley affected to be exasperated by while quite visibly not being. That evening, when Lily had dried out and been put to bed and Clara had gone home, and the rain was tapping gently at the windows, and the stove was making the small room amber and warm, Theodore and Elvira sat together on the settle by the fire, closer than they had sat before, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against him in the easy way of people who have found the right shape of each other. "I need to tell you something," Theodore said. She lifted her head and looked at him. "What is it?" Pete Alvarez has agreed to take my place on the drive, he said. I sent him a letter last week and had his answer yesterday. I told him I had found a reason to stay. She held his gaze steadily, the way she always did. A reason to stay, she repeated. The best kind, he said. She was quiet for a moment, and he knew she was thinking about everything clearly and honestly, the way she did everything, not allowing the warmth of the moment to outrun her own good judgment. He respected this entirely. He had not proposed it. He understood that what he was doing by choosing to stay was declaring his intention, not making a demand. I want you to understand, she said carefully, that I am not someone who can be taken care of. I have managed this property and this life on my own, and I do not intend to stop being capable. I know that, he said. I would not want anything different. I'm not offering to take care of you. I'm offering to be beside you. She looked at him for a long moment, and the firelight was in her eyes and on her face, and she was entirely herself, entirely beautiful, entirely serious. That is a very different thing, she said. Yes, he said. It is. She reached up and touched his face again, the way she had done before, her hand against the scar on his jaw, and this time he turned and pressed his lips to her palm, briefly and tenderly, and she drew a slow breath. Theodore, she said. Yes, he said. I think I am falling in love with you, she said, and the simplicity of it, the directness of it, was so entirely her that he almost laughed with the joy of it. I fell in love with you, he said, on the courthouse steps the first morning, when you came out looking like you had just done the bravest thing you'd ever done and were already planning the next brave thing. She smiled, and this time it was not small or private. This time it was full and warm and filled the room. You did not know me at all that morning, she said. I knew enough, he said, and I have been learning the rest ever since, and it is entirely consistent with what I knew that first morning. She settled back against his shoulder, and he held her close, and outside the rain continued, and the spring was coming in earnest to the Kansas prairie. And inside the small house that Samuel Reed had built board by board and Elvira Reed had kept standing by sheer force of love and will, everything was warm and good. Morrow's fence came down within the 10 days specified in the court ruling. Theodore was there the morning that Morrow's men dismantled it, and he watched from the property's edge with Elvira beside him, and Lily sitting on the top rail of the proper fence with her legs swinging, as the barbed wire was rolled up and loaded onto a wagon and carried away back across the boundary to where it belonged. None of Morrow's men looked at them. Theodore and Elvira watched in silence until the wagon was gone. Done, Elvira said. Done, he agreed. She slipped her hand into his without ceremony, and they stood together looking at the property's proper expanse, the restored acres running down to the creek tributary that sparkled in the morning sun, the cattle moving in the new grass, the cottonwood at the far edge where Samuel was buried standing with its new leaves just coming out, small and gold-green in the morning light. Over the weeks that followed, Theodore Hartwell became a fixed point in the life of the Reed property in a way that felt entirely natural and right. He set up his camp initially in the small barn, which was warm enough with the horses for company, and then over time shifted to a comfortable arrangement with Mrs. Weston that allowed him to court Elvira in all propriety while being available for the property's needs during the day. He was handy at carpentry, which was a fact that delighted Lily and proved practically useful, and he repaired a section of the house's south wall that had been letting in cold air since the previous winter. He fixed the well casing that Elvira had mentioned. He spent a morning with Lily going through her father's natural history books and answering questions about the prairie ecology with the same serious engagement that he brought to everything she asked him. He and Elvira walked the property together in the long spring evenings, talking in the way they had continued to talk, with the ease and depth that had been there from the first evening in the boarding house parlor and had only grown. He told her about his father, about Cincinnati, and the long years of reading law books, and the decision to go west that had been as much a young man's need to move as it was any rational calculation. She told him about her own girlhood, about her mother, who had been a schoolteacher before she married, and who had impressed upon Elvira with considerable force the idea that a woman's mind was as worth cultivating as any other aspect of her being. "She would have liked you," Elvira said one evening, looking out at the horizon. "Why?" he asked. "Because you listen," she said, "and because you don't seem frightened of a woman who thinks for herself." "I find it considerably more interesting than the alternative," he said. She laughed, that warm, genuine laugh that still did something particular to the air whenever he heard it. On a Saturday evening in late May, under a sky that was going pink and gold above the prairie, and with the grass fully up and green around them, Theodore Hartwell stopped at the rise near the eastern boundary where Samuel had liked to sit, and turned to Elvira, and said what he had been intending to say for some time. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because you need anyone, and not because the situation calls for it, but because I want to share my life with you and Lily, and with this piece of ground, and with whatever comes next. Because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I would spend a very long time being glad of it." She was looking at him in the way she sometimes did, where she was entirely still and entirely present, the look that meant she was giving something her full, honest self. "What about the drive?" she asked. "What about that life?" "I am done with that life," he said simply. "I was done with it before I met you. I just didn't know yet what I was done with it for." She reached up and put both her hands on either side of his face, the way you hold something very dear, and looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "Theodore, yes." He put his arms around her and held her close and looked out over the property that she had fought for and kept, the 40 acres of Kansas prairie under the enormous May sky, and felt the particular completeness of a man who has stopped moving because he has found the right place. Lily's response, when they told her that evening, was to look between them with that direct gaze and say, "I already knew." Then she asked when the wedding would be, how many cattle they were planning to acquire, and whether they would be getting a dog, this last question delivered with an air of casual inquiry that was entirely transparent about its actual urgency. They were married in June in the yard of the Sagebrush Flats Methodist Church, on a clear morning with the whole summer sky overhead, and most of the town in attendance, because the whole town had been following the story of Elvira Reed since she walked into the courthouse that March morning, and it had developed such a thoroughly satisfying resolution that people felt invested in marking it properly. Clara Hadley cried, which she did not appear embarrassed about. Beaufort Sims, the county clerk who had helped Elvira with the complaint papers, stood in the back with an expression of vindicated satisfaction. Orland Price was there with his wife, looking quietly pleased in the way of a man who has always believed that accurate record-keeping is morally significant, and has just had this conviction confirmed by events. Pete Alvarez came back from the drive for the wedding, arriving the afternoon before with dust on his coat and a broad grin, and a bottle of very good whiskey, and he stood beside Theodore at the ceremony with the ease of a man who has known someone long enough to be genuinely glad for them without reservation. Charles Beaumont sent a very fine silver-handled letter opener as a wedding gift, with a note that said he hoped they would never need to use it on legal documents again. Lily walked up the aisle between her mother and Theodore, holding both their hands, which was not precisely traditional but was entirely correct for the occasion, and which made the assembled guests produce the kind of collective softened sound that people make when something is exactly right. Elvira wore a dress of cream and gold that Clara Hadley had helped her make from fabric they had ordered from Dodge City, and she was so luminously herself that Theodore, standing at the front of the church watching her come toward him, had to breathe carefully for a moment to manage the fullness of it. She smiled at him when she reached him. The slow, private, full smile, the one that he had been accumulating since the first week of knowing her and which had not diminished in the slightest with familiarity. "You are extraordinary," he said quietly, because the occasion seemed to call for directness. "You are going to make me cry in front of everyone," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "I'll consider that a successful beginning," he said. The Reverend, who had clearly been told about the circumstances and had incorporated them into his service with some enthusiasm, spoke at length about the nature of courage and the particular strength of people who refuse to be diminished by those who mistake power for right, and about the way that sometimes the people who are meant to find each other do so through exactly the circumstances that are hardest to bear. Theodore thought this was genuinely well observed. They were pronounced man and wife in the full June morning, and when he kissed her, Lily tugged on his sleeve and said, finally, in a tone of patient relief that brought the whole congregation to laughter. The summer settled over the Reed, which was now also the Hartwell, property with a generosity that felt deserved. The cattle were doing well, and Theodore's experience of 10 years driving herds through the Kansas country gave him a range of practical knowledge about animal management and pasture rotation that he applied to the small operation with quiet satisfaction. He had a good eye for livestock, and he spent time that summer riding out to evaluate cattle the neighboring operations were selling, bringing back 2 additional animals that substantially improved the quality of the small herd. He fixed the rest of the south wall. He built a new chicken coop at Lily's request, with a design that Lily herself had drawn out on a piece of paper with a ruler, and he built it to her specifications without modification, which she considered the appropriate professional arrangement and which produced a genuinely functional chicken coop. They got a dog, as Lily had been requesting. He was a large, undiscriminating, enthusiastic creature of uncertain heritage, who Lily named Ptolemy and who, within 2 weeks of arriving, had appointed himself the primary guardian of the property, with a seriousness that was at odds with his exuberant personality. In the evenings, Theodore and Elvira sat on the porch as the summer light went long and golden, and they talked or they were quiet, and both were equally comfortable. She had begun to teach Lily from the books her mother had used when she was a girl, a proper organized curriculum rather than the schoolhouse in town, which Elvira felt was insufficiently rigorous. Theodore contributed to the natural history and geography lessons, and found to his own surprise that teaching suited him. "You would have been a fine teacher," Elvira told him one evening after Lily had gone in. "My father said the same thing," he said. "He thought I should have gone to university. Did you regret not going?" He considered this honestly. "I regret specific gaps in my knowledge," he said. "I don't regret the years I spent. They brought me here." She leaned against his shoulder in the easy, familiar way. "Then I am grateful for every cattle drive," she said. He put his arm around her and felt the particular rightness of the evening, the house behind them and the property before them, and the sky overhead going red and orange and eventual purple, and thought that if this was what his father had meant when he talked about a life well settled, then he understood it now in a way no amount of reading had managed to convey. There was one further development in the matter of Clarence Morrow, which Theodore heard about from Curtis Webb, the old rancher, in August. Commissioner Vance's investigation of land records in the county had expanded following his visit in April, and the examination of Harrison Mills's survey work had revealed 3 other instances in which Mills had produced surveys for Morrow's properties that were inconsistent with the original plat records. 2 of those surveys had resulted in boundary adjustments that had cost neighboring families land. One family, the Whartons, who had a small homestead north of the river, had been driven to sell after their water access was similarly compromised. The state had opened a formal inquiry. Morrow's attorney Haverstock was managing it, but the weight of documented inconsistency was making the management difficult. Mills had left the county, which was widely understood to mean that his testimony was not going to be available to support Morrow's position. The inquiry was expected to result in at least 2 of the boundary adjustments being reversed. Theodore told Elvira about it at the supper table, and she sat quietly for a moment with her fork in her hand. "The Whartons," she said. "Are they still in the county?" "I believe they are," Theodore said. "Tom Wharton is working the mill now, from what Webb says." "We should go and see them," Elvira said. "If there's something we can do to support their claim through the inquiry, I want to know about it." Theodore looked at her across the table and felt the same thing he always felt when she did this, the clear and uncomplicated recognition of who she was. "I'll send a note tomorrow," he said. They did go to see the Whartons, and they brought Beaumont's name and the documentation strategy that had worked for Elvira's case. And within 6 weeks, the Wharton claim was before the same inquiry, with the same kind of plat record evidence. Theodore helped Tom Wharton prepare the documentation, which took 3 evenings and some careful comparison of records, and the satisfaction of this was its own particular reward. Clarence Morrow did not emerge from the inquiry's process in the position of power he had occupied before it began. He was not jailed, which was the frustration of the situation, but he was ordered to restore 2 properties and was fined a sum that was substantial and publicly reported. His influence over Judge Fenton diminished as Fenton, now under scrutiny, found it advisable to conduct himself with greater propriety. Morrow still had money and land, but the particular untouchable quality he had enjoyed was gone, and Sagebrush Flats could feel the difference in the texture of its daily life. It was not perfect justice. Theodore and Elvira understood this without needing to state it to each other. The Delgado family had not gotten their land back. There were people who had been hurt by Morrow's operations who would not see any remedy. The law was a tool that worked better for some people than others, and that was a truth that one favorable ruling did not correct. But it was something. It was the record being made accurate. It was the public acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong. And sometimes something is what there is, and you do what you can with it. By the autumn of 1883, the cottonwood at the edge of the property had gone gold in the way it went every year, the same tree under which Samuel Reed was buried, and Elvira cut the last of the summer's wildflowers and left them at the grave on a Sunday morning in a practice she kept every year at that time. Theodore went with her and stood quietly beside her while she spent a few moments at the graveside, and he did not try to fill the quiet with words because the quiet was not empty. Walking back, she took his hand. "Thank you for coming with me," she said. "Of course," he said. "It matters to me," she said, "that you understand that loving you doesn't diminish what was, that these things exist together." "I know that," he said, "and I'm glad you still carry it. It's part of what made you who you are." She squeezed his hand, and they walked back through the gold-leaved property in the October light, the dog Ptolemy running ahead of them through the dry grass with his usual lack of coordination, and Lily's voice audible from the porch, where she was reading something aloud to herself in the absorbed way she did sometimes. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was cold and hard, as Kansas winters were, but the house was well insulated now, and the stove was good, and the larder was stocked. They had laid in firewood through the fall, and Theodore had brought the cattle operation through the summer's work to a position where there were 5 animals going into winter, which was a genuine improvement. They spent the long evenings reading and talking and teaching Lily, and there was a warmth in the house that was not only the stove's doing. By spring, Elvira knew she was expecting a child. She told Theodore on a morning in March, almost exactly a year from the day she had walked into the courthouse, and she told him directly, sitting across from him at the breakfast table with the same clear honesty she brought to everything. He sat with it for a moment and then felt something move through him that was so complete and enormous that he had no immediate vocabulary for it. "Are you all right?" she asked, watching him. He stood up from the table and came around to her and took her hands in his and held them carefully. "I am better than all right," he said. "Elvira, I am better than I have ever been in my life." She smiled and her eyes were bright, and he kissed her forehead and her hands and then her mouth, and she laughed against his lips in the warm, full way. Lily, upon being told, asked several medical questions of the informational variety, declared that she hoped for a brother because she already knew what having a sister felt like since she had been her own company all her life, and she was ready for different company, and then went back to her book having apparently processed the announcement to her satisfaction. The pregnancy was not easy, which Elvira managed with the same matter-of-fact determination she applied to everything, and Theodore was beside her through all of it without hovering, a distinction she clarified for him early in the process, and which he maintained faithfully. He did more of the outdoor work during the months when it was difficult for her to do it, without making it a thing to be commented on, just doing it. Clara Hadley was a regular and supportive presence, bringing food and offering experience and company with the easy reliability of a good neighbor. The bond between Elvira and Clara that had existed before Theodore's arrival continued to be its own strong thing, which he regarded with admiration. It was important, he believed, for a person to have relationships that were their own and not reliant on their marriage for their sustenance. In August of 1884, in the bedroom of the house that Samuel Reed had built board by board, attended by the town's doctor and by Clara Hadley, Elvira Reed Hartwell delivered a boy. He was a healthy, loud, and apparently opinionated infant who arrived in the late afternoon, and immediately set about communicating his views on the world with considerable vigor. Theodore held his son for the first time in the evening, standing by the window with the August stars beginning to show outside, and the boy settled against his chest with the particular compact weight of new life, and felt the kind of full-circle completeness that cannot be manufactured or anticipated, that arrives of its own accord when enough right things have found their right places. Lily appeared at his elbow, looking at her brother with an expression of scientific and sisterly interest combined. "He looks like a potato," she said. "Most babies do," Theodore agreed. "Will he get better looking?" "Considerably." She considered the infant for another moment, then said, "I think he should be named Daniel." She had been reading about explorers. They named him Daniel Samuel Hartwell, the second name for the man whose hands had built the house they were standing in, and Elvira wept a little when they settled on it, and Theodore held her and the baby together in the fading August light, and thought that this was what it meant to build something forward from what had been, to carry the love and the grief alike, and let them live together without canceling each other out. Daniel Samuel Hartwell grew into himself through the autumn and winter of 1884 and 1885, with the healthy thoroughness of a well-tended child, acquiring opinions and noises, and eventually a very determined attempt at crawling that Ptolemy the dog monitored with the gravity of a chaperone. Lily presided over her brother's development with the authority of someone who had read extensively on the subject, and was therefore qualified to advise, and their relationship had the particular quality of children who are far enough apart in age that Lily could be genuinely helpful without feeling displaced. Theodore had a conversation with Pete Alvarez in the fall of 1884 when Pete came through the area between drives, and they sat on the porch in the cool evening and talked the way they always had with the ease of long friendship. Pete held Daniel with the careful consideration of a man who was examining something extraordinary and new. "You look different," Pete said. "Different how?" Theodore asked. Pete looked at him over the baby's head with a measuring expression. "Like you stopped running," he said. "In a good way." "I did," Theodore said simply. Pete nodded. "It suits you," he said. "This whole thing suits you." Theodore looked at the property in the autumn light, at the cottonwood going gold and the cattle in the pasture, and the smoke coming up from the chimney, and at the window where he could see the warm light from the kitchen where Elvira was making supper and Lily's occasional silhouette as she moved around in there. "It does," he said. "More than I can say." Pete stayed 2 days and then continued on his way, which was Pete's way, and Theodore watched him ride out with the uncomplicated gratitude of a man who understood both ways of living and had found the one that was right for him. Spring of 1885 came with all the hope that spring carries, the green returning to the Kansas prairie in long sweeping floods of color, the meadowlarks singing in the early mornings from the fence posts, the creek tributary running full and clear through the property's eastern acres. Theodore had plans for expanding the cattle operation, modest and careful plans, the kind built on what the land could support and what the market could accommodate, discussed at length with Elvira over the winter in the close detail that they both enjoyed, the pleasure of thinking through a thing together and arriving at the version that was better than either had come to it with. He had also, quietly, been exploring the question of acquiring additional land adjacent to their current parcel, a 40-acre section to the north that its current owner, an older man named Ferris who was returning to Ohio for family reasons, was willing to sell at a fair price. It would double the operation's capacity and give them winter pasture that they currently lacked. Theodore had gone over the numbers carefully, and they worked, just, with the savings from the previous year and the cattle sales from the fall. He brought the proposal to Elvira at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with the numbers laid out clearly, and she studied them with the focused attention she always brought to financial matters and then looked up at him. "You're certain about the water on the north section?" she asked. "I rode it twice," he said. "There's a seasonal pond and the soil is good. It will hold the additional animals through winter without difficulty." She looked at the numbers again. "If we do this, we have very little margin for the unexpected." "That's true," he said. "The cattle drive last year paid better than we anticipated. The well casing held. We have been fortunate. And if we have another hard winter, then we sell 2 animals and tighten everything for a season," he said. "But I believe the investment is worth the risk." She drummed her fingers once on the table. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." He felt the particular pleasure of a decision made together, a decision that neither of them had made alone. By July of 1885, the north section was theirs, and the expanded pasture held 12 cattle moving in the tall grass, and on a clear summer morning Theodore rode the full perimeter of 80 acres and felt the weight and the permanence of it in a way that was entirely new to him. The way property feels when it is genuinely yours and built by your own work and that of the person you love. That same summer, Elvira discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier, the early difficulty less pronounced, and she moved through it with a kind of settled confidence that was different from the first time. She continued teaching Lily through all of it, continued her walks of the property, continued the correspondence she had begun with a women's homesteader organization in Topeka that was working to document and support the land rights of widowed and single women in the state. She had written about her own case for their publication, a careful and factual account that had apparently been widely circulated, and had brought her 3 letters from other women in similar situations who wanted to know about the legal steps she had taken. She answered all 3 with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, providing Beaumont's name and the specific references to the Platte record approach. Theodore had read the piece she wrote and told her it was excellent, and she had told him that it was only accurate, and he had said that accuracy in service of justice was its own form of excellence, and she had looked at him with the expression that was warm and full and had not diminished in more than 2 years. "You are always saying the exactly right thing," she said. "Not always," he said, "but I've been practicing." In February of 1886, Elvira delivered their second child, a girl this time, who arrived in the late morning with considerably more patience than her brother had demonstrated, and who had, from the first hours, a quality of watchfulness that Elvira recognized immediately. Lily looked at her new sister with a different expression than she had regarded Daniel, something more complex, a kind of recognition. "She's going to be trouble," Lily pronounced with the authority of a 13-year-old who has considerable experience being the kind of girl who is difficult to dismiss. "Good," Theodore said, meaning it entirely. They named her Clara Ruth Hartwell, the first name for the neighbor who had been there for all of it, and Clara Hadley, informed of the honor, sat in the kitchen and cried with a generosity of feeling that required considerable time to recover from. The years that followed were full years, the kind that are difficult to summarize not because nothing happens but because everything happens, the ordinary and the extraordinary woven together into the texture of a life. Daniel grew into a serious boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's capacity for patient attention, and by the time he was 3, he was already following Theodore around the cattle operation with a proprietary interest. Clara Ruth grew into exactly the person Lily had predicted, curious and willful and bright as the morning, and when she was old enough to walk, she walked directly toward whatever interested her without looking for permission, which her parents regarded as the most promising thing about her. Lily turned 16 in 1890 and had read through every book in the house twice and was beginning to talk seriously about the normal school in Topeka. Theodore and Elvira had conversations about it in the evenings that were sometimes difficult because the idea of Lily going was hard, and always ended in the same conclusion, which was that they had raised her to reach for the world, and it would be the worst kind of love to hold her back from it. Lily went to normal school in the fall of 1891, accompanied to the train by the whole family, including Daniel, who was 7, and Clara Ruth, who was 5, and Ptolemy, the dog, who had come to the station under the impression that this was a different kind of outing and was confused by the proceedings. Lily hugged her mother for a long time on the platform and then hugged Theodore with the same depth and told him quietly, just for him, that he had been exactly the kind of person their family needed. He held on to that for a long time after the train had gone. Theodore turned 46 in 1895, and Elvira turned 43, and they were exactly themselves, which was to say they were weathered and knowing and still very much in love in the quiet daily way that outlasts the early fire and becomes something deeper and more durable. The property had grown to include a 3rd parcel and a small but sustainable cattle operation that employed 2 hands from town in the busy seasons. The house had been expanded, a proper 2nd room and a covered porch that ran along the south side where the light was good in the mornings. He had never gone back to the drives. Pete Alvarez had retired from driving himself and had a small ranch outside of Dodge City, and he and Theodore exchanged letters twice a year and saw each other when the occasion permitted. Curtis Webb, the old rancher, had died in 1889, and Theodore had spoken at his funeral, which he had found was something he was glad to do for a man who had been quietly decent in a place where quiet decency was undervalued. Orland Price had retired from the county recorder's office in 1888 after 20 years of keeping accurate books, and there had been a small civic ceremony in his honor that Theodore and Elvira attended, and at which Theodore made a point of finding Price in the crowd and telling him plainly that the outcome of their case would have been different without the precise and honest records he had kept. Price had shaken Theodore's hand with the considerable feeling of a man receiving something he had not expected. "I only did my job," he said. "That is exactly what made the difference," Theodore said. Charles Beaumont died in 1892, which was a loss Theodore felt genuinely, and his obituary in the Dodge City paper mentioned among his cases the Reed land dispute of 1883, which had been notable for establishing a precedent regarding the primacy of original plat records over private surveys in Kansas boundary disputes. Theodore read this aloud to Elvira at the kitchen table, and she was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said finally. "Let it be on the record." The spring of 1897 brought a piece of news that Theodore heard from the new county recorder, a young man named Delacroix who had an interest in the county's legal history. The Delgado family, whose land had been taken before Elvira's case and who had never been part of the formal inquiry, had been located in New Mexico, where they had resettled after losing their Kansas land. A legal aid organization that had been working with the documentation precedent established partly by Elvira's case, had contacted them, and was exploring whether a remedy was possible under current Kansas law. Theodore told Elvira about this the same evening he heard it, and she sat with it carefully, knowing it was complicated and possibly not resolvable after so many years, knowing also that the attempt mattered regardless. "I want to write to them," she said. "The Delgados. Even just to let them know that what happened to them was remembered and was wrong and that people have been trying." "That seems right," Theodore said. She wrote the letter, 3 careful pages, the following morning. She received a reply 6 weeks later from a woman named Maria Delgado, the daughter of the family, who was now an adult and who wrote with a kind of controlled emotion that Elvira recognized. The letter said that it mattered to her family to know they had not been forgotten, and that the documentation was being reviewed, and that she hoped Elvira and her family were well on the land she had fought for. Elvira kept that letter in the same tin box where she kept Samuel's original land deed, and the certified copy of Orland Price's plat records and the first letter from Beaumont, and the court ruling from April of 1883. The tin box lived on the shelf in the bedroom and represented, she had once told Theodore, the record of what had been fought for and what had been kept. Lily came home from Topeka in the summer of 1897, now a certified teacher, having completed her studies with the marks that surprised no one who had ever watched her read a book, and asked questions with the relentless precision of someone who intends to understand everything. She had a place at the schoolhouse in Sagebrush Flats that had been offered her by the school board, and she took it with the satisfaction of a person returning to a place she chose, rather than one she was obliged to return to. She brought with her a young man named James Collier, who was a law clerk in Topeka, and who had been courting her for a year. James was earnest and thoughtful and extremely anxious about meeting Theodore, which Theodore found endearing and Elvira found funny. He made a point of putting James at ease as quickly as possible by asking him about the law and discovering that the young man had genuine knowledge and passion about land rights and property law, which, under the circumstances, was approximately the most welcome possible answer. "I like him," Theodore told Elvira that evening. "I know you do," she said. "Lily chose well. She always had good judgment," he said. "I wonder where she gets it," Elvira said dryly, and he laughed, and she laughed, and outside the open summer window the Kansas prairie was exactly as enormous and beautiful as it had always been. Daniel, at 13, was already the practical heart of the cattle operation during the summers, working alongside Theodore with the quiet competence that was simply his character, and that Theodore watched with a particular mixture of pride and affection. He was going to be a fine man, the same way Samuel Reed had been a fine man, solid and honest and careful of things that mattered. Clara Ruth, at 11, was reading everything she could find and asking questions that were beginning to exceed the household's ability to answer them. And there were conversations about her education that mirrored the ones they had once had about Lily, the same pride and the same recognition that raising children who reach is its own responsibility. Theodore Hartwell sat on the porch of the house on an evening in August of 1897, with the sun going down over the Kansas prairie in the long, flat gold of summer, and Elvira came and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one, and settled into the familiar architecture of sitting together, her shoulder against his, the whole of the property before them and the whole of the evening ahead. Ptolemy had died 2 years ago, full of years and dignity, and had been buried under the edge of the porch by Daniel and Clara Ruth, with a gravity and ceremony that was entirely appropriate. There was a new dog, a young shepherd named Bessie, who was currently chasing a jackrabbit in the far pasture with entirely misplaced optimism. The cattle moved in the pasture. The cottonwood stood gold at the edge of the property, the same tree, the same grave beneath it. Lily and James were inside, talking with Daniel about something that involved considerable arm gesturing on Daniel's part and laughter on everyone's part. Clara Ruth's voice came from somewhere above, through the window of the room she shared with no one and had entirely filled with the evidence of her interests. "Are you happy?" Elvira asked him, not because she did not know the answer, but in the way that people ask things when they want to hear them said. He turned and looked at her, at the lines that time had put around her eyes, and the silver that had come to her hair at the temples, and the green of her eyes that had not changed at all from the morning he had seen her coming down the courthouse steps 14 years ago, fierce and capable, and already planning the next brave thing. "I am exactly where I want to be," he said. "With exactly who I want to be with. There is not a thing in the world I would trade for this." She leaned her head against his shoulder with the easy certainty of a woman who has been loved well and has loved well in return, and they sat together in the August evening as the light went warm and low, and the prairie stretched away in every direction under the enormous Kansas sky, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and it was good. It was very good.